Okay, no.
All right, here we go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Joining me is Professor Warwick Powell from Australia. Dr. Powell has been an astute observer of international politics, particularly regarding to China. We are now entering a very interesting times, Dr. Powell. A lot has happened since we last talked a week ago. Mr. Trump is now demanding, China to help him to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And he even threatened that he will postpone his trip to China if China does not comply. Please give us your takes.
Well, the last I checked, the Straits of Hormuz is open. A number of ships destined for China carrying oil are getting through without a problem. And I seem to recall that the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, also declared the Straits open. So I'm not quite sure what President Trump's talking about. All jokes aside, the fact is that Iran has demonstrated the capacity now to control the Strait of Hormuz and to do so indefinitely. There is no military capability of the United States or Israel or anyone else for that matter that is in a position to change that. And the clear evidence of that constraint or limitation is that President Trump himself has been asking around and demanding others step up and come to America's aid. No one substantial anyway. I think the Czech Republic might have decided to send something.
Argentina too.
Argentina.
Also Argentina.
Argentina, of course, it'll take a bit of time to get from Argentina to the Straits of Hormuz, but Argentina's already also said that they'll send something. These are performative gestures, of course, because neither of those countries has any serious belief that their gesture can make a meaningful difference in a military sense. So what we have now is it's actually a very significant moment. It's a transformation, if you will, in our understanding of the global balance of power. The United States, which has for many decades projected itself as the sole superpower able to push others into doing whatever the United States wanted for fear of being coerced or worse, has now confronted an adversary that pushed back to a point where the United States actually can't achieve what it set out to achieve in any military sense. This has long-term implications, of course, because it really sends a very clear message globally in lots of different ways that the United States, that the era of unipolar hegemony is over. It's also important because I think it sends a message to folk upstream and downstream of the Straits of Hormuz. If you control the tap, the governor, then those upstream and downstream are compelled to pay some attention to you and perhaps take you a little bit more seriously, stop treating you with disrespect and actually engage with you in a meaningful way. If you're upstream, and by which I mean the Gulf states, the oil and gas monarchies that have long been the beneficiaries of the American protection umbrella, if you were those guys, I think you would now be seriously reflecting upon who will lead the outreach to Iran to begin some kind of a discussion as to what a post-American Gulf modus vivendi looks like. Because without that, the wealth and the power that came with it for the Gulf monarchies will rapidly erode. If you can't get your principal source of wealth through the gate's controlled by someone else, at some point, the riches that flow back upstream dry up on you as well. The attempt to shunt oil through the Red Sea, firstly going across ground with the pipelines, is likely to run into the Houthis at some point, and that will see the closure, in effect, of that part of the world as an energy source until a regional security architecture emerges, and one which takes into account the genuine security needs and expectations of Iran. It's amazing, isn't it, Carl, where the two big conflicts in the world, and there are others where the United States is putting the squeeze on much smaller countries in ways that are, I think, frankly, is unbecoming even of a major power. To starve people deliberately simply because you're much bigger than they are is frankly despicable. But Ukraine and this situation in the Persian Gulf both involve two major countries. So we're talking about a country of 90 odd million in the case of Iran, and 160 odd million, 140 odd million in the case of Russia. Both of these countries were basically shoved off to the edges, even though they have intimate connections into a particular region, and then treated as if their concerns and issues didn't matter at all, and that they could be trampled upon. And 4 years ago, we saw Russia's official reaction to all of this, or more comprehensive reaction, if you will, after Crimea and before that Georgia. And of course, in this particular instance, the United States brought this on itself, about 3 weeks ago. So upstream, we're going to have some implications, and I won't be surprised if a part of the settlement that emerges over the next so many months will be a modus vivendi involving the Gulf states and Iran. This will be a total disaster for America. There is now talk, of course, that the Americans are going to send in ground troops, not just in relation to Karg Island, but in relation to the mainland of Iran proper. Now, anybody who has done any military analysis historically will tell you that an attempt to invade and occupy a country of that size geographically and that size population-wise, on top of which is a very complicated and difficult terrain and topography, we're talking upwards of 800,000 to 1 million troops or more. Right? This has all the hallmarks of America's 21st century Vietnam, where hundreds of thousands of mainly working class kids will be sent to fight the battles of the political and economic elite. And that's a tragedy in and of itself. Now, why would a President Trump do this? Well, what off-ramp, as they say, does he now have? He can't unilaterally declare victory and pack up, because this war doesn't end just because of America say so, or President Trump say so. This war ends when Iran says so. And so, you've got a President Trump scouring around the world looking for, ways in which he can tilt the balance and maybe spin his way out of this. None of the serious European powers have come to play. Japan even has rejected his overtures for the time being. Let's see what happens when Takaichi visits Washington. And I think the overtures to China, I don't think, from what I've seen so far, that China has actually even bothered deigning it with a formal response. It's simply made a indirect remark about it being a question of national sovereignty and moved on. I don't think Beijing sees this request come demand or what have you as a serious proposition. And in any case, I'm sure that there are plenty of people scratching their heads, Carl, in Beijing, wondering why China would come to America's assistance in this particular quagmire. let's not forget that 15 years or so ago, after the global financial crisis, which frankly was a transatlantic financial crisis in the main, China came to the aid of the global financial system and the American economy in substantial terms. In fact, one of the reasons why the Chinese economy ended up with a bloated property sector is because of the injection of liquidity that emerged as China assisted the United States in boosting global liquidity again. So, and it got no thanks for that. In fact, it got sanctions, technology restrictions, tariffs, and the rest. So, once bitten, twice shy, right? So, I'm not sure that China's overly keen. I think that there's couple of other issues, just very quickly, and then perhaps we can delve into them a little bit more. Clearly, in the short term, well, maybe there's three things. In the short term, I think China isn't set up anyway to go around the world intervening in the way that Americans do. So it's not really an outfit that has the means to do the kind of interventions that the Americans sort of think is what big countries, ought to do. The second thing is that I think China is wary, as I mentioned, for some of those other reasons, but also because it is still trying to work out how best it is that it can provide a stabilizing outlet that can absorb some of this destabilizing energy in the world, whilst at the same time being able to keep what is at the moment a very fragile show on as even a keel as possible. And to do that, it's treading quite cautiously in, quite typical Chinese fashion, considered, cautious, nothing rash. But I think that there's a third thing, and that is if you project yourself forward 10, 20, 30 years, I think the calculation in Beijing is that a long-term civilizational prosperity cannot be founded on a dependence on hydrocarbon as your principal energy source. And so some 15 years or so ago, China began in earnest very significant efforts to electrify its economic structure, the entire machine, if you will. That's not to say it doesn't use hydrocarbons, right? So people shouldn't misunderstand that for the time being, but as a proportion of its total energy structure, electrification from a variety of sources is playing an even greater role than it's ever done before and will continue to do so. And hydrocarbons will play a proportionately smaller role going forward. And because of that, I think the people in Beijing have come to a view that at a strategic level, China's own security and stability, together with its ability to deepen its networks globally through the export of energy-related capabilities, batteries, solar, renewables, all the way through eventually to nuclear and fusion, hydrogen, etc., etc. Because of its capabilities in those areas, it's actually in a very solid strategic position as the sort of 20th century hydrocarbon-based economies begin to unravel. And what's going on in the Persian Gulf in some respects is a reflection of all of that.
What about Donald Trump's claim that, well, since China is depending on some oil flow from the Gulf more than United States, it's really China's problem. It's China that should try to unplug the flow of oil through the Gulf.
Well, before the United States went into the Persian Gulf and attacked Iran a few weeks ago, the ships moved freely, right? So if there is a blockage, it's been caused by American action. Secondly, as I mentioned right at the outset, tankers destined for China are moving through the Straits of Hormuz anyway. So in that regard, I don't think there's any sense that the that the governance of the Straits of Hormuz is in any way whatsoever disadvantageous to China's economic requirements insofar as oil flows are concerned. So what is there to reopen? We see data in the Financial Times, I think it was, that shows that Iranian exports today are greater than they were a month ago through the Straits of Hormuz. So in that sense, China itself doesn't have a problem. The other issue, which is a bit of a cartoon trope, is that somehow the Chinese economy is excessively dependent upon oil from the Straits of Hormuz or the oil from Venezuela. And therefore, if you can cripple these two supply sources, you'll somehow cripple China's economy. And that's based on, I think, a pretty simplistic understanding of the structure of the Chinese economy in terms of its energy systems. Oil has been playing a progressively lesser role from an energy point of view in terms of China's economic model. The other thing about oil is that it's not just being used for energy, it's also an input for other things as well. So, and those things is about manufacturing stuff that's petroleum based. And so there is some impact unless those things can be substituted. But as an energy source in and of itself, the Chinese economic structure is no longer as oil dependent as it once was. From memory, some 20% or so of the Chinese economic system is based on oil as an input. The other thing to remember is that coal liquefaction, which is creating oil from coal, is actually a very mature technology with a substantial infrastructure and footprint across China. And China's got a lot of coal. 20 years ago, I was actually talking to a colleague of mine last night in China from this industry specifically. And we were going through some of the engineering and cost issues and the evolution over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, much of the technology for the coal liquefaction, so coal to oil infrastructure, was premised on imported technologies. And that meant that for Chinese domestic coal to oil projects to be competitive, oil prices had to be at about $70 US dollars a barrel. Today, talking to my colleagues in China about this, because of the developments of indigenous technical capability in this particular industry, the break-even point is around $50 US dollars a barrel. And so for the past so many years, when international oil prices have hovered around that mark, a little bit more, a little bit less, it's been difficult for this particular industry domestically to crank up. But mark my words, when prices sustain themselves at $100 a barrel, then the coal liquefaction industry will kick into gear and replace a bunch of the imported oil in any case. Now, there are some adverse environmental consequences as a result of that, but China is not really going to suffer a dramatic shortage of energy coming from oil, as perhaps those sitting in the White House looking at their, sheets of paper and reading the cartoonish kind of tropes that you see around the place, that these interventions in Venezuela and Iran are going to somehow cripple China's economy. So it may well be part of their calculation, Carl, that this is what this is all about. If it is part of their calculation, it's premised on some pretty outdated views about China's economic structure, number one, and a very shallow understanding of how China's energy mix actually works in any case. So, if you're relying on this as a strategy to bring China's economy to heel, then you're going to be very, very disappointed.
Do you think the the expected Trump visit to China will still take place because it looks like Trump is signaling that he might not go to China, either probably because he does not want to go at this particular time, given that he got US into this quagmire, and he will go to China with a much weaker hand. I mean, there's a lot of neoconservative think tank like Hudson Institute that has been reporting, the whole reason Trump go after Venezuela or Iran is to get the leverage on China, so the US will have its hands on the energy supply lines to China that will allow Trump to go to Xi Jinping, with much a stronger hand at the negotiation table.
Yeah. Well, as I said, Carl, if that was the theory, I don't think the reality actually supports it. Venezuelan oil and Iranian oil, or oil from the Gulf for that matter, represents a relatively small proportion of total oil, and oil at writ large is about 20% or so of energy, of China's energy. So, yeah, look, taking two supply sources out of a mix is always inconvenient. But if somehow people think that means China just doesn't get oil to meet its needs, let's say that these two sources were taken off the table, there is a thing called the global oil market. Now, what none of these other places actually, meaning the rest of the world, they've been fortunate that China has been securing some of its oil from these two sanctioned places, because otherwise China's going to be in the global market buying it, and that will, of course, push prices up. So the fact that China has actually been taking some of its oil from these two places has alleviated upward price pressure in the global oil market today. The Trump visit to Beijing, scheduled for, or Trump announced it for the 31st of March to the 3rd of April, is likely to be postponed, I think. That's certainly the noises. And there's a few interesting observations I think people have made and we can make about it. One is that the Chinese side has actually never confirmed a date at all. They've always spoken about, we're in discussions with the American side about the dates of the visit. It's the Americans who've announced dates. That's the first thing. We've had some trade talks over the last week between the major representatives of both sides. The readout suggests that not much headway was made insofar as either side was concerned. Very status quo, but perhaps in the current environment, no change is better than anything at all at the moment. But there's nothing there that represents any significant breakthroughs that could form the basis of any major announcements. There's been some talk about things like a board of trade and a board of investment, but they're sort of made for social media kind of statements rather than substantive agreements that I think leaders, particularly Chinese leaders, would be willing to sign off on. They're not just in this business to be ceremonial. They're in this business to achieve tangible and enforceable outcomes. The other thing too, of course, as you say, is that we've got this unfinished Iran war now. And whilst that continues to play out, I think President Trump has some problems. One is that as commander-in-chief, leaving Washington in the middle of a war is arguably, if nothing else, a very bad look. The second thing is that there are possibly some very significant decisions that President Trump is going to have to make very soon. And they go to whether or not the United States commits to ground troops. And if it commits to ground troops, again, I think a president making that decision in absentia is a bad look politically. And in a midterm election cycle, sending young American men and women into war, when I think everybody knows that a large proportion of those young men and women will only come back in coffins, and for the commander-in-chief to make that decision outside of the country and not be in the country explaining that decision, again, very, very bad look. Just because it's a bad look, of course, is not a reason why President Trump would be persuaded one way or the other. But I think that there is an incredible amount of pressure now for President Trump to stay in Washington whilst this self-induced crisis engulfs Washington. The other thing too is that it's not just a political problem with the Democrats. It's a political problem inside the Republicans and inside the MAGA movement itself, where we are seeing clear divisions emerge, and to a point where there are historically strong MAGA voices now calling for Vice President Vance to distance himself from this debacle and position himself as the alternative to keep the MAGA flame, burning. So far, Vance has largely equivocated and been silent, missing in action, perhaps some would say. But in that kind of environment, I think it becomes increasingly difficult for President Trump to be in Beijing, possibly with very, very few cards to play, possibly with no capacity to make meaningful agreements on anything, with a crisis unfolding that is uncontrollable, whilst possibly getting a good dressing down in Zhongnanhai or in the Great Hall of the People. None of that, I think, plays well for America. And so it is, I don't think anybody would say that it would be imprudent for Trump to postpone this trip. What I found was funny, Carl, was when first there was the, well, I won't go unless they send, boats in to open up Hormuz. Then you had Besant saying that that's not the reason at all. The reason's the war. The messaging itself is a complete dog's breakfast. It says something about the state of the administration at the moment, or should I call it the regime, the pederast protection regime in Washington, perhaps. But the regime is all over the shop, and if I was President Trump, one of the things that I would be most worried about in the back of my mind is being in Beijing when something catastrophic happens on the battlefield that would be militarily disastrous and reputationally humiliating. Now, if that happened whilst you were there in Beijing, I'm not sure you'd be able to live any of that down again. And avoiding that seems to make some sense.
Yeah, actually worries me that the U.S. 5,000 U.S. Marines have already left Okinawa, and right now they're actually very close to makes the transit through the Strait of Malacca, heading toward the theater of operation. Because the thing that worries me is it takes 2 weeks. It's going to take them approximately 2 weeks to move into position. That means they expect the war to go on for at least another 2 weeks, which is really inconceivable given the current situation in Hormuz, because this is causing a huge disruption in the global supply chain. While China is best positioned to weather the storm, there are countries who are heavily depending on the Gulf oil. There's countries like,
not just oil, as we talked about last week, Carl. There's all the fertilizers and other chemical products. This is it's a global disaster caused by the United States and Israel.
Yeah, and there are countries like U.S. allies in East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, they're all very heavily dependent on the oil exports from the Gulf, and China, for its part, has already banned export of refined petroleum products like gasoline and diesel. And Australia, for one, depending on 32% of jet fuel from China. That 32% is just gone right now. And to think that this whole thing will go on for another 2 weeks, Japan might be a little bit buffered because they do have a large strategic oil reserve. The other countries, I'm not so sure. It's gonna
oil reserves, agricultural food production, and are obviously at the front of the impact areas. And but I think this could go on for more than 2 weeks, because in addition to the transit time for the Marines to even get there, the ability for the United States to continue bombing Iran is likely to go on for a few more months at current tempo. It has the ability to do that. And it'll need to do more than that if it wants to interdict Iranian capabilities and ultimately reduce it. It has reached a point where the Iranians are also leveling out and attacking with a relatively consistent rhythm. And I suspect it's a rhythm that they can sustain from a production and repair, replenishment point of view for a long time. I've seen analysts who estimate that at the current tempo of drones and missiles, particularly some of the shorter range missiles, that Iran can keep this going for years. And the challenge for the United States is that for the United States to keep up this tempo, it's basically delivering much of this at the moment from a distance, and it's going to need to get closer. So as it gets closer, as the planes need to start flying over Iranian airspace, those planes become exposed to being hit by missiles, right? So for America to sustain this, it will need to take greater risks. It doesn't have bases in the Persian Gulf from which it can launch much of its attacks, and so it will be coming from a long, long way away. Last week, Iran took out a couple of airborne refueling planes of the Americans. And again, you start taking out that kind of infrastructure, and the ability to sustain a certain tempo of bombardment diminishes. And without that, the Americans are going to struggle to even try to turn this situation around. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And where we're heading, an American political scientist, Robert Pape, has talked about in previous research work and continues to talk about it in relation to this particular war, the risk of an escalation trap that the United States has actually created and has entered into an escalation trap. It can't get out of this escalation spiral for fear of not only reputational damage, but actually material power diminution globally. And so it has to keep going. And as it keeps on going, it will take greater risks. It will put the lives of even more young Americans on the line. And that then leads people to talk about this as potentially the 21st century Vietnam for the United States. I mean, we know through the Pentagon files that were leaked that those inside the American state actually knew well in advance that the United States could not defeat the North Vietnamese. And yet, for years after that knowledge, the United States continued fighting this unwinnable war. In fact, a war that they would inevitably lose. They knew this, but there wasn't the political courage from anyone inside the system to actually accept defeat. And so they poured more lives in, diverted more national resources, into war as opposed to into nation building, and hope that they could push the problem to the next presidency. The risk we have now is that President Trump will seek to push this to the next presidency. Now, whether that's viable or not, I think, we can debate about that at the moment. I don't have a strong view at all as to whether or not this war can be sustained by the Americans, even though it can't win, for another 3 years. But the risk with these things, these escalation traps, is that the political dynamics means that Washington will do this. They'll just keep pouring men in, and come up with whatever excuses. The media will, from time to time write something critical, but by and large will continue to create the impression that headway is being made. Surprise, surprise, similar patterns been going on in Ukraine as well. Ukraine's not a winnable war, but nobody wants to actually accept the consequences of initiating the war, let alone wrapping one up, because wrapping one up means accepting defeat.
Well, that's a depressing thought, because, what I had hoped, a quick climb down for Trump, because this is what Trump liked to do, is to spin everything as a victory for himself. And then, there were indication of that, when he said, this is not U.S.'s problem. What happened in Strait of Hormuz is the problem for the Europeans and Asians. Yeah.
Let's say he does that, right? Let's view this in a pro-life kind of way, which is that he brings American aggression in this war to a halt sooner rather than later, declares victory and goes. Let's say he does that. Well, what does Iran do? Well, I don't think Iran stops until Iran gets what it wants. Now, what's Iran's concerns? Well, Iran's principal concerns is that the Americans will come back and have another chop later. So that's its first concern. How do you mitigate against that? Well, the Americans say we won't do it again. That's probably not good enough, given the bad track record of American deal making. So Iran will insist that the Americans have no presence in the region. That's something they're clearly pushing very hard to achieve today. What else does Iran want? Well, Iran's also made clear that it wants reparations to finance the rebuilding of cities that have been bombed by the Americans, and to compensate those families who have lost loved ones. Now, how are they going to get that? This sort of doesn't end neatly, just because President Trump says, "Well, we killed the political leader, the spiritual leader. We've taken out the head of security. Job done. Let's go." Well, it takes two to tango, and once you create this kind of a security problem for a state like Iran, it does want to seek a solution to this. Again, we can draw parallels with what's happening in Ukraine, where the Russians, again, whether you like it or not, the Russians have been articulating a view that they have legitimate security concerns, and that they want those concerns to be acknowledged and baked in to the agreements and the architecture, right, of a region. Same for Iran now. There will be insistence on a whole raft of agreements, I think, about American basing, in other words, no bases. They will need to have agreements with the Gulf monarchies, because the Gulf monarchies will want to ensure that they've got safe passage for gas and oil. And we're going to see a dramatic change in the security architecture of the region. This is a monstrous defeat, by the way, for the Americans. And this is why just walking away and saying, "I've won," is not going to complete the issue. The other thing, of course, is President Trump, in a sense, can say whatever he wants. But if no one else in the world buys the claim that, I've won, well, you've still got the same problem, because everybody can see that the United States has not prevailed in this particular combat, that it has been severely debilitated in some respects. We've all seen reports of the proportion of its arsenal that has been consumed in 3 weeks. Total arsenal. This isn't getting replaced tomorrow. A colleague of mine has been crunching some numbers, and he goes by the name of Policy Tensor on X, and he's been running some interesting numbers and developed some models on the drone warfare dimensions, and he's published those, which clearly indicates that the Iranians can keep this going for a long time, and the Americans are in no position to bring it to a halt. I've actually supplemented some of that, though it's unpublished at the moment, because I don't think the raw data is good enough. But which is looking at the missiles situation, and develop some mathematical models around missiles depletion, interdiction rates, etc. And all of this paints a very grim picture from an American point of view. And so I'm sure that for those who actually have access to much better information, namely the Americans themselves, about their own inventories, the serious people, as opposed to the folk in the White House, the serious people have actually been doing the sums as well, and they know that they are not in a position to keep this going in a meaningful way with any hope of changing the military trajectory. And the only thing that keeps this going is actually politics, right? And it's the politics of the midterm elections, the politics of a presidency that doesn't want to be responsible for not just a humiliating defeat in a generic sense, as Vietnam ultimately proved to be a humiliating defeat, as Afghanistan was a defeat, etc. But this is potentially actually an era-defining defeat that literally draws a line under the 35-year era of American unipolarity, the 70, 80-year era of the political West, the post-war political West era, and arguably 450, 500-year era of the colonial West. I'm not sure that that's the legacy that President Trump wants to leave behind.
Yeah, which means this war likely will drag on longer than anybody would have hoped for. This is very grim, because the whole world is basically being pushed toward precipitous abyss, and we are it's just on autopilot. But the train is going on autopilot.
I hope 3 things can happen in the short term. One is, given that Iran controls the governor and has clearly been willing to let ships through, that countries will ultimately arrive at agreements with Iran for the safe passage, not just of oil to keep a lot of this stuff going, because that one's going to be held quite tight, but fertilizers, right? I mean, because in the end, ensuring that the world has the capacity to feed itself matters. And I think from a reputational point of view, it would be in Iran's own broader diplomatic reputational interest to enable that to happen. The second thing I think that I think this catalyzes is actually the acceleration of electrification. It's not to say that hydrocarbons disappears tomorrow. It will continue to play a role, but more effort's going to be made to transition to non-hydrocarbon based systems. More effort's going to be made to hasten the development of new technologies. Whether it's in, as I said, the renewable energy space, electrification of passenger motor vehicle transport. China leads that. Electrification of freight transport. Come 2030, 30% of China's heavy road freight vehicles will be actually electrified. I mean, that's amazing, because 10 years ago, if somebody said, look, freight transport is going to no longer be diesel based but electric, people would laugh at you. The idea that transport could be dissociated from hydrocarbons was unthinkable 10 years ago, and yet this is exactly what's going to happen. And so we're going to see a lot more of that. So and this is accelerating something that I think was happening anyway. But what country that does not have its own oil would leave itself structurally exposed to future oil risks such as those we're witnessing today? I don't think anybody would do that, given the availability of alternatives. In 1970s, when the first oil shock took place, there were very few alternatives. There are alternatives today. And what that means is that China in particular is in a position to play an outsized role globally, but not in a way that oil-rich countries were able to, because they controlled the upstream. The nature of renewable energy technologies and energy sovereign technologies and energy storage technologies is that once you've got them, other people can't turn them off on you. And that is going to be incredibly attractive to countries around the world, particularly in the global south, but not just the global south. I'll look at a country like Australia, where I am, and Australia is now in the middle of a re-energized debate about what the energy profile of the country looks like in 10 years' time. There are those who argue that Australia needs to build a few more refineries. Others are now saying, actually, we can electrify our commercial fleets within 2 to 3 years if we actually had the political will to do so. Right? But this is a debate that's going to accelerate all across the world. And so, I think we're going to start to see some transitions. We're going to start to see the acceleration of electrification, not necessarily a bad thing. And on the food front, I think in the short term, I certainly hope that the Iranian government will see that it can play actually a constructive and responsible role in terms of fertilizers. But the other thing I think we're likely to see as a result is a change in the way that many places actually think about their food systems and their own agricultural systems that have, over the course of the last 100 years, become increasingly dependent upon these sorts of fertilizers. But again, we have to ask the question, is this system, which has these risks, the kind of food systems that we as different societies want to have going forward? Or do we want to reimagine our national food security in entirely different ways? I don't know where this will go, but these events no doubt will provoke these debates.
Yeah, I have no doubt the entire world will move toward that direction. The question is, can they move fast enough? Before the oil runs out, because right now the problem, there's still, even as Iran is allowing some ships to go through the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, the traffic is still fairly light.
Very light.
Yes, and
look, think of it. I know you take one little country as a case in point, Australia, right? Australia has less than 30 days of gasoline and diesel. That's not a lot of time, and at some point in time, that if this persists, then available stocks run out. There's already talk now actually, about whether or not Australia needs to have what's the word? Well, regulations basically, and rules about who gets priority to use things, and whether it should be prioritized by industry. Rationing is the word I'm trying to think of.
Rations. Wow.
Rationing. There's already talk today. Now, not coming from the government, I might add. The government's trying to play the everything will be okay, we've got things under control position. The opposition, of course, is the Chicken Little. The government's not done enough. It's all going to go terribly wrong. But there are also serious people saying, well, if we've got 25, 30 days of fuel, and if this conflict persists, then at some point we are going to face supply side constraints. And if those supply side constraints become material, literally in 4 to 6 weeks' time, and we can foresee that because it takes a couple of weeks for the ships, 3 weeks for the ships to come through. Well, it's actually very easy to see into the future at what point you're going to start to have insufficient stocks of fuel in Australia. And the decisions will then have to be made about prioritizations in the short term, and then what does the place do medium term? And that those decisions, I think, are potentially ones that need to be made inside the next 3 to 4 weeks, right?
Now,
so you asked the question, right? Can we solve all of this in time before the oil runs out? Well, it depends on the country. But Australia, as just an example, doesn't have a long lead time on this. Japan has a long lead time. Philippines doesn't. Mainland China has a long lead time. The little province of Taiwan does not have a long lead time. South Korea does not have a long lead time. So that's just our region, right? I think Malaysia is actually a net exporter. So I think it's probably going to have a little bit more buffer, right, as we've discussed before. A place like India does not have long lead times. India's got, not only problems with liquid fuels, it's also got problems on the gas front as well, right? Restaurants are already shutting and having limits placed on them, where you can run your kitchens for an hour.
This is why India went to Washington to ask for a waiver to continue to buy Russian oil and gas. And this is actually why Washington has temporarily suspended the sanction on Russian oil and gas, because even Washington know they need to increase the oil supply to the world. And this is why, when stupid people like Gordon Chan says, oh, why do we allow Iranian oil tanker to sell to China? Well, because even United States government has realized they need to do whatever they can to make sure the oil continue to flow. More Iranian oil goes to China, that means the less oil China needs to buy from elsewhere to free up more oil supply.
Absolutely. The other thing is the United States also imports oil too. This is the thing that I think all of this talk about the US having lots of oil, it does, is one of the world's, in fact, it's the world's largest producer, really. It is, but it doesn't mean it doesn't import stuff, because there are many different kinds of oils, and to process and distill and things, you do need different kinds of inputs. So the United States also is exposed to the dynamics in a material sense and in a financial sense to the global oil markets. And look, this touches absolutely everybody. And we've seen gas prices in the US now rise to $4 a gallon. And I saw in the last 24 hours data on the average diesel retail price which has hit just on $5 a gallon in the United States. In fact, it's only the second time historically that it's gone over 5. Last time was during the COVID pandemic. So, this is a very substantial spike. I was contacted last night by, out of the blue, somebody who runs a small town depot where they just had diesel delivered, and the new retail price is $4.82 US. So that's nudging up to that average of 5, essentially confirming what's going on. So, United States businesses and consumers won't be immune. And you think about the, households are affected, of course. But when diesel prices go up to the $5 mark a gallon, 2 big industries are affected straight away. One's obviously agriculture. A lot of the machinery, of course, runs using diesel. On top of which, they've got the fertilizer challenges now, right? But the second one is freight. So moving goods around the United States, including food, is dependent upon diesel. And you bring these things together and you've literally got a general cost increase across the board because everything gets transported, and anything related to food is going to be hit. What are farmers going to do? Are they going to absorb this increase in diesel costs? I doubt it. Right? They're in enough pain as it is, and so we're going to start to see this happen. Now, who are the beneficiaries? Well, there are beneficiaries, of course. President Trump made that very clear. When oil prices go up really high, he says America makes a lot of money. What he means is American oil companies make a lot of money. And we've seen this happen before. During the pandemic, when prices went through the roof, American oil companies made a lot of money. Ordinary households and small businesses and other businesses lost as a consequence, but big oil did very, very well. Again, we've got these dynamics at play, and the American economy is already under a lot of pressure, and these increased transport cost pressures and food production cost pressures are just going to make things worse in the context of a midterm election, right? I mean, this is creating what's the word? A cyclone or a whirlpool or it's a political storm all coming together, and in that environment, what worries me, Carl, is the fact that this war is likely to go on longer than 2 weeks. I can sort of see clearer. Not that I've got a crystal ball or anything, but I think anybody who can exercise their brain can sort of see that there's a good chance this lasts a bit. But who can predict what madness comes out of Washington when these political forces are let loose?
Well, I'm. It's actually pretty shameful in United States. There's even MAGA factions that are against the war, but the Democrats has said relatively little. they have largely stood on the sidelines. It's the system is broken.
What's so disappointing about all of this is, look, there is no anti-war movement to speak of. That's the first thing, which, to me, having participated in Palm Sunday marches, in the late 70s and early 1980s, I sort of still have memories of, peace movements and things. But it is that political silence, right, where a political judgment's been made, which is, why say anything when your political opponent's doing so much damage to themselves? But that's not the point. The point is to actually articulate a substantive position, right? Which is that come November, should this still be going on, we will do something about it. And if you elect us, we are going to use the powers that we have as members of Congress to do X, Y, and Z, because this war is a disaster for Americans first and foremost, right? American reputation globally, secondly, and of course, if America pretends to have any sense of status as a global leader, the negative effects across the world on wealthy countries and poor countries alike, it should be something that an American political class has the guts to say something about. And it doesn't. It doesn't have the guts to say anything about it. They just sit there whilst President Trump acts unilaterally, surrounded by yes men. And when people resign, clearly someone with some capability, this is the counterterrorism bureau head, the first thing that happens is that it gets attacked for being soft. I mean, it's truly remarkable watching this from afar, that a political system actually makes it possible for something to go this far and to go this much off the rails, right? This is why it is a systemic problem. If the system can't bring this sort of irrational, destructive, self-destructive behavior to heal, then what chance does it have? What chance does anyone else have? And I'll go out on a limb. The only chance that people have at the moment, the only chance, like it or not, is to throw a rope and hope that China grabs it and pulls you in tight, because it's the only stable ship at the moment on this crazy stormy sea.
On that note, I think thank you very much, Professor Powell, for sharing your insights. Every time I have you on my show, I'm always learning something new. If people want to follow you, where would they go?
Yeah, my Substack, warwickpowell.substack.com. Firstly. Secondly, I've just published a book which is available on Amazon. It's called Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters. Paperback, hardback, and Kindle formats available. And thirdly, I have my own little special channel, special because it tends to bring voices from the global south to a global audience, on YouTube, TIO Talks with Warwick Powell. So they're the three things. Appreciate it if you followed it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powell, for making your time to speak to us. And you're preaching to the choir when you say the system is broken. And I know the American system has been broken for a very, very long time now. It just now we're seeing the disastrous consequences, and we'll have to see where this takes us. And so thanks for my audience for sticking with us. Until next time.